the low poly, high poly, and I've labeled them LP, HP. It's usually a good idea too to start kind of getting organized, getting your stuff labeled properly. So I'm going to focus on the low poly, so I'll hit Control 1. Again, for some reason my shortcuts aren't always working here, or they get a little goofy, but... So in this case, this thing is made up of a lot of overlapping pieces, which is fine. So even though it's technically one object, there are almost sort of separate floating pieces within this object. This is very, very typical of a production type of mesh. So in this case, I'm going to just sort of reset the UVs. So let's just pretend this thing had no UVs. So I'll just go into UV and do a planar. Sometimes what I'll do is kind of go piece by piece and take, let's say, the body. The body is fairly square, so one of the most intuitive ways to kind of unwrap this is to simply go in and do a create automatic. The problem with this is that it does kind of create all these little broken pieces. So sometimes what I'll do is I will take a piece like this, take this UV shell. Let's grab that. And if I look at the edges, I will sort of double click around the border edges. So this thing is kind of like a box, right? And you can sort of see there's a split happening down here. So a lot of times, you know, I do want to flatten objects out. And when you're looking at UVs, I guess the main sort of, you're sort of trying to balance two ideas at once. One is to flatten a 3D object with as little distortion as possible, but you also want to try to minimize seams. And a lot of times those things can be potentially in direct opposition to each other, or it can be challenging to kind of balance the two. The way I usually look at where I put my seams is to say, where is there a major angle change, right? So from this flat surface, there's a major angle change here, which is why I do basically need a split across here, right? Especially at corners. Any corners that are extruding inwards, such as these corners, right? You probably need to split at the corners of this little piece. You know, the outer corners of this object obviously will need to be split there. But I do want to minimize seams. And automatic unwrapping just kind of, as it says, it just automatically flattens stuff out. So what I will try to do is take a piece like this, and I may try to go into Shift, right click, and do a move and sew edges. So if you take a look now, right, it looks more like a flattened little box, right? So that actually will give me good results with less seams or less splits. Now seams and splits, I am actually warping this a bit here. You can see because of this curvature, I will probably need to separate, but I will want to keep, let's say, the main larger edges intact. So I can clean up this little piece and basically do a cut. And if I go grab the shell, Shift, right click, unfold. Before I do that though, there are some settings I want to talk about. So I usually will configure my unfold and then try to save it as a default setting. So in this unfold tool, you should leave it on unfold 3D. Don't switch it to legacy, leave it on unfold. For layout, I want it to lay out UVs. So what can happen is if I don't turn this on, let me show you what happens, and I'll hit apply. It'll flatten, right? It'll sort of flatten and unfold. And you see it's leaving the shell where it is, which is fine, but it's also sometimes rotating the shell piece a little bit. So I often don't want it to rotate the shell piece. I want it to sort of remain sort of straight and level if I can. So adding that setting in layout UVs helps. The other thing is for you guys, most of the time in production, in class, if you're working on a project, most of the time your UV layout will probably be in 4K or above. So if I go to 4096, that I usually prefer as my default resolution. And then there's room space. You can set this to 16 pixels. So what happens is when you have all these little UV shells, they can be packed right up against each other. And sometimes what happens is if you plan on smoothing the mesh later, it can pull the seams apart and show a texture gap. Also, if you're painting in Photoshop, you may accidentally paint from one UV shell onto the next, and that causes some sort of strange crossover or bleeding. So we usually want to give each UV shell its own little space. So that's why I would set that to 16. Now I would save these settings out, file save, and these will be basically my new defaults. So when I hit apply, it's actually going to sort of orient this thing. It'll move it into the UV space as well. So right now it's kind of floating outside the main UV tile or the main UV square, so it's placed in here. I actually did rotate it again, but that's okay. So let's move that over. One other thing I'm noticing, I'm just taking a look at this this UV shell piece, and I think this object, you have to check your object. Let me go to my object level. You want to make sure, again, your object is set to scale 111. So if your object was scaled 20% on one axis, 5,000% on another, you may have to go to Modify Freeze Transforms in case there's a weird issue with that. I'm double checking mine and it seems fine. So, all right, let's keep going with this. I'm going to go to UV shell. So sometimes too, you know, the UV's in the layout, so your main UV space is this square here. A lot of times as I go, I want to repack the space, so I'm going to shift right click and go to layout. And again, I'm going to go to my layout options and cover my preferred settings. So I'm going to reset this to the default. So my preferred resolution, again, we're working in 4K. In some productions it may work higher, like 8K, which is 8192. So you may have to set that to 8192 if it will let you, but in this case I'll just set to the max 4K. The other option I turn on is preserve 3D ratio. So what that basically means is that no part will be disproportionately larger or disproportionately smaller than another part. Sometimes there are exceptions to this, like if you have a character, you usually want the head to take up maybe half the texture space because it's going to be seen in close-up. But in this case I will you know, leave it to preserve the ratio. The other defaults are fine, except again at the bottom I want to increase my texture map size for the layout, and I want padding as well. Remember, UV shell padding should be 16, and then for the tile, which is basically that square tile that it'll pack it into, I want a border as well to protect it from the border. I'll set it to 16 pixels. That's basically what it's going to pack in. And again, I'm going to edit, save settings, and then do a layout. So, you know, it's a starting point. Is it perfect? It's not necessarily perfect, but I will continue to work on that. So again, I may try to sort of stitch some of these things together. So if I grab this tile, usually I start by kind of double clicking around the outer edge, and then I will try a quick move and sew. In this case, there's some tiny edges here, so I may just focus on maybe these pieces, these larger edges. Shift right click, move and sew. And if you take a look now, look at that shell, right? It's one sort of larger, cleaner piece. This area in here, I'm going to have to investigate. I'm going to double click that opening and see if that's connecting to anything. I think it's these little extrusions here. So again, there's a lot of complex kind of edges that are coming in and out. So I think I may actually split this piece back off. So I'm going to just cut that off, and it's going to be its own shell now, right? This will be a shell. This will be a shell. And so when you highlight shells, it will often show you other connected pieces. So let me just double click around this. Yeah, I want to see if I can get those interior edges maybe to connect up to this. So go move and sew. So these edges are now, you can see there's actually an overlap happening here, so I think I'm going to undo that last move. What I may even do as well is split these corners, because right now this is basically like a frame. It's just open, and it may take up UV space that I find valuable, that I need. So I may actually split this into 4 pieces. So I'm going to hold Shift, right click and cut. And now maybe I can move and sew these little pieces individually. So let's just do create UV shell as well. So move and sew. Grab this. Where is that going? I'm not sure, but I'll find a home for it somewhere. Move and sew. And then let's see which one. I'll try move and sew. So like I said, automatic can kind of get you somewhere to start, but you may have to do a lot of manual stitching and a lot of manual editing. So I'll try to take something like these dials next. Now I can try to unfold this. If I unfold it, it may do something really, really weird, because again, there's some extreme angle changes in that dial, and it'll kind of cause the tool to struggle a bit, and it will try to flatten out. But if we turn on our checker just to test this thing with, I usually like to turn off, I will turn on the checker here as a temporary texture display, and I'll turn off the display image inside the UV editor. If you take a look, it may be distorting. So a lot of times I find what I need to do is sort of slice off the top part, right, and then maybe slice through the middle of this, and I'll go to cut on that. Back to shell. So with anything that's sort of cylindrical, I'll tend to do something like that. So I'll do another unfold here. Another strategy, so you can see that white edge there, that's a seam or a split in the tile. So there it's actually splitting, and it should be more distortion free or very close to distortion free now. Again, whenever there's an extreme angle change, so I may need to split this again through here. You know, anytime there's a big angle change, you typically need to create an additional split. You know, there's a little bit of distortion happening here, so now the other question is, can I live with it? Live with that distortion? That distortion underneath the dial is really kind of isolated to this area and this area. Maybe I can get away with that. So, you know, sometimes I'll leave it and just move on to the next piece. In cases like this, if I isolate this, just so you guys can see that, this piece, right, is just a little lens. So sometimes what I'll do is actually just go into Planar. So Planar Map is literally trying to get a snapshot of a flat piece of mesh. Right now it's actually coming in from a side view. So if I go to Create Planar, I often will have to adjust the options. So you can say, maybe I'll try this on the X-axis instead. And you see it's now kind of snapshotting it from that sort of more of a frontal view, right? And as a final way to work out any distortion, I almost always in these cases will do another unfold, and it should remove any potential distortion. Unfold is basically the specialized mathematical algorithm that looks at the 3D vertices, compares it to the UV vertices, and says, okay, how can I lay this as flat as possible, you know, without any distortion, basically. Now, my preference, by the way, this is my own kind of default UV checker tool that it has. I usually like to see my own material, so let me just delete history for a second on this thing. Let's go back to object mode so I can grab the whole low poly and just isolate the low poly again. There. So I'll go in here, delete my history, and then for this, in this case I've got a blend, but I'm going to just load a simple checker on that. Usually I like a nice gray checker, gray and white checker, and I'll set this to 20 by 20, and then hit 6 so I can see it in the viewport. Okay, so we can sort of see any stretching, any distortion. Also, what you can do as well for your shading is just go into use flat lighting if you want, so you can really get a kind of clean look at what the checker is doing overall without any interfering shading. So the bigger pieces that are sort of left right now are definitely this area. So again, I think because it's a fairly flat piece, I would try to start with a simple planar map, right? And it's already aligned. And again, you can see, you know, it's not quite square. It just kind of fills the UV workspace with this piece. So I'll try to do an unfold on that as well. So it's going to take a second. Again, there are some extreme angle changes, so my likely fix for this, if you guys can see it, right, this angle change here, I will probably split from this edge, right? So I'll go to, and you can see that distortion happening. So maybe these two edges here, I'll actually cut them, and then go to shell. I'm actually just going to go grab everything for now and do a quick unfold and see what happens. I like to live dangerously sometimes. Unfold sometimes will screw up when there's not proper cuts in certain pieces. So sometimes you'll say it'll give you a non-manifold error. That non-manifold error could be an indication of mesh problems, but it also could be an indication that you don't have enough cuts on certain pieces. Like this piece, for example, Not sure what's happening with that, so I may try to do another just quick planar on it. And then if I take, remember, major angle change, right? Shift, double click along these edges. Oh, remember what I said too about non-quads? That whole back poly is a non-quad, so I can't quickly just double click an edge and go around. So let me actually grab that face. I'll fix that really quick, doing my extrusion technique, right? So do my extrusion offset, and then just do merge to center. So that may affect the UVs as well. Sometimes when you edit a mesh as you're working on a particular piece of mesh, it will mess up the UVs, but let me grab those two edges and do a shift, right click cut, and go to shell, and I'll just grab over the whole piece here, and then when I do an unfold, you'll see it'll come out distortion free in a second. So it'll have a nice square checker on everything. And just to remind you guys too, while this thing is kind of calculating, a square checker basically means your UVs will not be distorted, right? Or your textures will not be distorted. So imagine the checker pattern is representing pixels. The pixels should be square. In this case, there is one piece that is still distorted, right? Which is this sort of piece. It's trying to flatten out, and it is, but it's doing it in a very distorted way. So I usually need to split again where there's a major change. So I'll probably split at these kind of corner bits here. I'm sort of arbitrarily picking something that's roughly middle of these rounded corners, right? So I'll do a cut, go back to shell, and I'm going to re-unfold these. Oops. Let's grab those and then do a re-unfold. And the better the cuts are, the faster the unfolding I find tends to work, the more stable it will be as well. It'll be less crash happy, if you want to put it that way. So that's a lot cleaner, right? So you can see these pieces now. Remember what I said earlier as well. You know, I may try to stitch together. So I want to look at the front face, which is, which piece is that? This is the front shell here. So I'll take my biggest edges and try to do maybe a move and sew, right? So you see how nicely that sort of flattens out. It looks like a box basically that's been flattened. So maybe from here to here, I'll try to do the same thing. You know, in this case, it's causing a distortion because of the curvature, so I'm going to undo that and leave it as is. Okay. So do unfold. Just try to unfold everything again. So this process, like I said, it gets fairly repetitive. But once this is all done and well laid out, it should be okay. Let's go to flat shading again. So what I would start doing is kind of looking for the obvious problem pieces, okay? So this piece here is a little bit kind of broken. Again, I think this is another non-quad or non-triangle piece. And this one is a unique case. I can't just do an extrusion merge to center because it'll create some really gross mesh. So let me just close this out for a second. Give me one more minute, and I'm going to just clear this thing, break connection. So what I might do is kind of focus on this part of the body. So I'm going to hit Control-1 to unhide everything and then re-isolate this. So this is something else. You guys may have seen this. This should technically be open, right? But there is this kind of weird triangulation happening. And that I believe is happening because Maya doesn't know how to interpret these polygon edges. So if I take maybe this piece, let's go to vertex mode for a second. You know, there's some vertices here. So I may try to just simply go in and do a connection to these polys. Yeah, this is a good situation. This is where we encounter. Yeah, basically when you're doing UVs, I'll mention this. When you're doing UVs and you encounter a problem, this is where you're going to really figure out if your mesh is good or not, or if it's clean or not. When you start getting into UVs, that's when you find out where the truth of your model is, basically. In this case, you know, I have a problem here with this archway. I may try to delete that poly to sort of clean it up. I think there's actually some problems with the mesh overall, so I may actually take this whole front side. because it's a flat piece and it's covered, I can actually get away with just sort of deleting those trouble polys. And then I could simply go in, and if I double click this edge, I usually double click an edge to see if I can highlight a nice clean opening. Can you guys see this too? There's still some weird mesh in here. There's like this floating archway. So I'm not sure what that is. Let's take a look and investigate. I can double click the edges, and if I pull them out, there's also some other mesh there, right? So I think in this case, I think I can safely delete that and clean out that piece. And because there's other detailed mesh that's just sitting on this, it's just going to be a flat piece. I should be able to simply do fill hole. What did Maya say? No. Fill hole. What's it saying now? Okay, so looks like there's some other problems popping up with this model. Okay, so I'm going to undo a bit before all this. So, like I said, you guys have to be careful if you're having problems with your mesh. I'm going to hide my low poly. Okay, let's hide the high poly and then focus on this low. So, sometimes I may need to do what's called kind of an exploded view. So, I'm going to pull this piece off and just, again, double check. This sort of looks like a bad Boolean operation, right? Can you guys see that? So this is why I often recommend avoiding Booleans wherever humanly possible. I'm going to pull that piece back and sort of see. So, okay. Again, I'll try to isolate this thing again, hitting Control 1. And I will delete that face, delete this face, delete that face. And then I believe these edges here. You know, Maya is a little strange too. Sometimes it will allow you to do some things and clean up a mesh a certain way. So I'm going to just double click. This piece looks like it's gone. Sometimes you have to delete vertices. Sometimes you have to delete edges. Sometimes you have to collapse vertices or delete faces to clean up a model. I'm going to hit Control 1 to unhide again. Now I can leave this front piece as kind of a floating face. I think that'll be okay. But I will need to fill in the gap of this face. So I'm going to try something. I tried, if I double click around, it should go around cleanly. When I did fill hole though, it did something very weird. It kind of created a bug of some kind in the mesh. And then when I double clicked again, so I'm not sure that's going to work. So what I might try instead is to simply go in, grab these two edges from top to bottom, and simply try to do a bridge across. So that, I think, is going to work okay. If I double click around here and try to do fill hole now, not working, but I'll try another bridge in this case. Let's see if that works. Bridge. So that's okay. Yeah, it looks like, again, there's some, depending on the edges I'm selecting, there might be some duplicate edges, right? So usually this is a good opportunity for you to find out if your mesh, like I said, has any errors or not, and you'll have to start kind of cleaning up that model. So I'm going to go in and do a target weld from this point to this, and I'll do probably the same on this side. It may be mirrored on this side as well. No, in this case it's actually not a problem on this side. So now there is one issue, right? The other issue I had is that I think there's some vertices floating behind here, probably from my cleanup operation. So I'm going to try to just target weld these down into that corner. I'll do roughly the same thing here. It's not affecting the overall profile. It's not destroying it in any way. So that's back. But again, as I mentioned, you may have to kind of sometimes interrupt your UV editing to kind of go through and do some detective work on some bad mesh. I'm going to grab these front pieces that I had that I was trying to work on. And I'm going to go to Create Planar Map again. All right, let's go back to our shaded view. There we go. So that, I think when I do the next layout, this should be a lot better overall. In this case too, Maya added this great option in 2018. If it does detect any like destructive or non-manifold mesh, you can tell it to always fix non-manifold geometry. Hopefully it won't do anything horribly destructive and will actually fix your problems and allow you to unfold and layout. So I'm going to let it process. So again, a lot of times, you know, I'm sort of hunting for weird shapes too, right? So if there's big pieces that are kind of floating behind, I may need to break them up at the corners. So I think that's from that front facade. So I'm going to double click into these corners, do a cut on there. You know, these corners I probably need to cut, and again, there's a weird bit of mesh I can see from a distance, so I'm going to make sure it splits nicely at the corners. And then again, I'm going to look for, again, weird polygons and stuff too. If they're floating out there, hanging out there somewhere, chances are, you know, in this case, there's a flat plane. I'm going to go to vertex, grab that vertex, because this is where I did my extrude, offset, and then collapse. If I hold control and convert this to a polygon face, I can now go in and do a create planar. Again, the planar is coming in from the wrong side, so it's going to do this weird warpy stretchy thing. So I'm probably going to go in and adjust my planar options to now go from the Z and project. Okay. Most likely I have to do the same thing over here. So go vertex, control, right click, and drag to to faces. So it'll select all those faces, and I'll basically do the same planar map there. So I'll grab all the shells and lay them out. Getting pretty close to done. I still have to go through and do the cylinders. You know, one other thing you can do with cylinders, I often will do this, is you can go in and create a cylindrical unwrap. So it sort of creates a little cylinder, and you can pull that thing around so it gets less distorted. The problem is these flat faces on the bottom side, or if there's some on the top side, they will not, so let me just do a quick unfold on it so you can see. They will not be treated properly. They're still technically attached, but they're just super flat in this cylindrical unwrap, so you will have to split them off. So I'll try to finish up with this, and I'll send you guys on a break. But so yeah, on these faces here, you see it's kind of split them off. So I usually will do these as their own unwraps. So I'll do a planar, and again, the planar unwrap is coming at it from a weird sort of side view, which you guys can see here. So in that situation, I need to go back in and go to planar. I'm going to set this from the y-axis, so it's looking from top to bottom basically, and project, right? Because this is where that flat plane is aligned. And so that takes care of that. And if I double click these two pieces and do another unfold, they'll be laid out nicely and cleaner. So I basically repeat that same process for all those little sort of peg legs and maybe even some of the dials, right? So if I go to shell, let's grab those and just pull them over. So they're distortion free. So you know, I could almost repeat that process in a way just by grabbing all of the flat sort of planar discs on the bottom here. I'm going to convert my little vertex selection to faces. So all the faces are selected, right? And if I do create planar, all of them are sort of taken care of at once, right? And then I would do a unique cylindrical. Just hit G to repeat. So you can go really fast, you know, if you're hitting G to repeat the command, you've got similar parts, just you can keep cranking them out. So I'm doing an unfold now because what that will do is, again, work out any distortion, lay things nice and flat. I don't like the rotated pieces, so I may kind of manually rotate certain pieces to get them to lay better in the scene here, but yeah, this would be essentially the process. I'm going to just take this and split. Again, I usually like to try to hide my seam edges somewhere where it's maybe a little more obscured, so I'll do a cut on that piece, shell, and then unfold. Now, so I mean, I could bore you guys to death, which I think I'm already doing, but essentially this process is highly repetitive. So I'm going to keep looking at the checker pattern, searching out for distortions, and anywhere where there's major angle changes, either in corners, inner, outer corners, inner, outer edges. Usually that's where I'll find cuts and split them. And if I can find ways to then minimize some of the excess cuts or gaps and sort of create something that looks like a flattened box, let's say like this piece that you can sort of see the edge of here. You know, I'm trying to optimize the space minimize seams, but maximize UV space as well. So